The Thornton family reunions were never about warm hugs or shared memories. They were a stage for financial flexing, a showcase of who could claim the biggest slice of success. This year's gathering unfolded in a sprawling lakeside mansion just outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. Its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the restless shimmer of Lake Michigan under a late summer sky. I, Midge Thornton, slipped into my usual seat near the stone fireplace, clutching a plain iced coffee. My eyes scanning the room as my cousins turned the polished mahogany dining table into a battlefield of boasts. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary roasted lamb and the clink of crystal wine glasses, but the real feast was the ego-stroking. Just closed a deal on a logistics startup in Austin, James, my cousin, drawled, adjusting his monogrammed cufflinks with a practiced flick. AI-driven supply chains. It's basically printing money, $20 million in projected revenue by Q3 next year. His smirk was as polished as the silverware. Lillian, my other cousin, wasn't about to let James steal the spotlight. She leaned forward, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier's glow like a tiny constellation. Please, James. We just bought a penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast. Lakefront views, private elevator, the works. You can't put a price on that kind of exclusivity. Her laugh was sharp, a blade wrapped in velvet. I hid a smirk behind my coffee mug, the ice clinking softly against the glass. If only they knew. My family saw me as the Thornton black sheep, the 34-year-old freelancer scraping by in a rented loft in Lansing, cobbling together a living designing cheap websites for small businesses. To them, I was a cautionary tale, proof that not every Thornton was destined for greatness. But I was content to let them think that, for now. Midge, Aunt Margaret's voice cut through the chatter like a shard of ice, her eyes narrowing as she fixed me with that familiar mix of pity and judgment. You're awfully quiet tonight. James leaned in, his grin dripping with faux sympathy. We were just wondering about your situation. And there it was, the annual ritual of dragging me into the spotlight, not to celebrate, but to dissect. What about it? I asked, setting my mug down on the linen tablecloth, my voice steady. Lillian tilted her head, her perfectly manicured nails tapping her wineglass. That little apartment in Lansing, she said, feigning surprise. Still freelancing, right? Designing those websites for mom-and-pop shops? Her tone was saccharine, but the barb was unmistakable. I nearly laughed, the sound catching in my throat. The Lansing loft they pitted me for wasn't just my home. It was the first property I'd purchased through Nexlify Solutions, my tech company, now valued at $1.5 billion. Nexlify specialized in cybersecurity software and AI tools, powering the backbones of Fortune 500 companies and even the startup James was crowing about. To my family, I was a struggling tenant. In reality, I was their landlord, their investor, and the one about to turn their world upside down. I like my place, I said evenly, meeting Lillian's gaze. The loft was a cozy, brick-walled haven with exposed beams and a view of the Grand River, a far cry from the sterile luxury of this mansion. I'd chosen it not because I couldn't afford more, but because it grounded me, kept me connected to the real world while I built my empire in the shadows. You're 34, dear, Margaret sighed, her pearl necklace glinting as she shook her head, as if my life were a personal affront to the Thornton legacy. It's time to grow up. Get a real job, maybe even buy something. Her voice was heavy with the weight of her expectations, as if my existence were a smudge on the family's polished reputation. Real? Try a portfolio of 47 software patents, contracts with global corporations, and a silent majority stake in James's precious AI startup. 6 months ago, Nexlify had discreetly acquired 60% of his venture through a private equity arm so well cloaked even James, with his self-proclaimed sharp instincts, hadn't sniffed it out. I'd also bought the building where Lillian's marketing firm leased its glossy office, though she'd never suspect her freelancer cousin was her landlord. I managed just fine, I said, leaning back in my chair, the worn leather of my jacket creaking softly. Lillian smirked, swirling her wine. You can't even afford a car payment, Midge. I let them talk, their words bouncing off me like rain on glass. Tomorrow, the shareholder agreement for James's startup would cross their desks, and my name, Midge Thornton, CEO of Nexlify Solutions, would be emblazoned on the letterhead. My dad, Robert, finally looked up from his whiskey, his eyes tired but kind. "Now, James," he said, his voice low, "not everyone's got your knack for deals." It was his half-hearted attempt at defense, but it stung more than the barbs. Dad had always been distant, more comfortable with numbers than emotions, and his silence spoke louder than his words. "Midge chose her path," Margaret added, her tone heavy with disappointment, as if I'd squandered the Thornton name by not marrying a venture capitalist or launching a lifestyle brand. They thought I spent my days coding budget websites for dive bars and bakeries, barely making rent on my cramped loft. They didn't know that Midge Thornton was Nexlify Solutions, the anonymous firm that had been quietly reshaping the tech landscape across the Midwest for the past 12 years. I traced the rim of my mug, remembering the early days, nights spent coding in a dorm room at Michigan State, fueled by cheap coffee and a stubborn belief that tech could do more than make billionaires richer. I'd started Nexlify at 22, a scrappy startup built on a shoestring budget, driven by a mission to create cybersecurity tools that protected people, not just profits. By 30, I'd turned it into a powerhouse, but I'd kept my name out of the headlines, letting Nexlify's work speak for itself. "Speaking of tech," James interjected, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip, "have you heard about the drama with my startup? Some firm called Nexlify Solutions bought a controlling stake. They're digging into the books like hawks." He scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Probably some Chinese or Dubai tycoon looking to flex their cash." I kept my face neutral, though my pulse quickened. I was the buyer, and I had no plans to dismantle James's startup, just to clean it up. Nexlify was known for ethical innovation, for building software that empowered communities, not exploiting them. Unlike James, who treated his startup like a personal ATM, or Lillian, who billed her Paris shopping sprees as client outreach. "If you're still in that loft," Margaret said brightly, her voice dripping with condescension, "you could always move into our guest cottage in Holland. We'd help you find something respectable. Maybe even someone respectable." The implication was clear, a husband, preferably one with a corner office. "I'm good," I replied flatly. "My landlord's pretty happy with me." Lillian gave a tight laugh, her eyes glinting with amusement. "You can't live small forever, Midge. Thornton used to mean something in Michigan. It still did, just not the way they thought." In tech circles, Nexlify was a name whispered with respect, a company that balanced profit with purpose, funding free coding boot camps for kids in Detroit and Lansing while securing data for global banks. "Actually," Dad said, setting down his glass with a soft clink, "this reunion's partly about business. The board's worried about Nexlify's takeover of James's startup." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "They bought control 6 months ago," he continued, his brow furrowing. "No one knows who's behind it. Could be a foreign investor, maybe Russian or Singaporean." Lillian nodded, her lips pursed. "Has to be. These types love snapping up Midwest tech for the prestige. If only they knew the tycoon was sitting right here, in a thrifted sweater and scuffed sneakers, nursing an iced coffee. I'd grown up in this family, watched them build their empires on flash and favors, and I'd chosen a different path, one they couldn't even see." "They're asking tough questions," Dad said, his voice heavy, "especially about our accounting. Creative accounting, like how James had funneled $1.8 million in startup funds to buy his Austin condo, or how Lillian had listed her $50,000 Paris wardrobe as client engagement expenses." Margaret's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her wineglass. "I'm sure it's fine," she said, but her voice betrayed a flicker of unease. "The Thornton name still carries weight." "That's just it," I thought, my fingers brushing the edge of my canvas bag, where tomorrow's audit reports lay waiting. This Nexlify person didn't give a damn about names or legacies. They'd ordered a full forensic audit, and I could see the panic rippling across their faces, hidden behind designer smiles. An audit would uncover more than just questionable expenses, it would crack their entire game wide open. "Maybe Midge could help," Lillian said suddenly, her tone sugary, as if I were a child who'd stumbled into the grown-ups' table. She does, tech stuff, doesn't she? Maybe she knows someone at Nexlify's management company. They all turned to me, their eyes shifting from pity to calculation. Just like that, I wasn't an embarrassment, I was potentially useful. I mostly work with small clients, I said smoothly, my voice calm but my mind racing with the irony. Nothing on the scale of James's startup. For God's sake, James snapped, his patience fraying. You can't even help your own family? Mom, who'd been silent all evening, shot him a warning glance, but her silence said enough. Even Dad was back to staring at his whiskey, uninterested in defending me. They had no idea how helpful I was about to be, just not in the way they hoped. Tomorrow morning, Nexlify Solutions would release a public statement, effective immediately. James's startup would undergo a complete operational overhaul. No more siphoning profits. No more inflated contracts. No more treating the company like a family credit card. I glanced around the dining room, my eyes lingering on the details they thought I'd never notice. The abstract painting above the fireplace, bought with consulting fees from the startup's budget. The imported Italian wine, expensed as a client dinner. The chandelier, installed by Lillian's friend's firm at triple the market rate, with invoices padded to cover her vacation to Santorini. Anyway, I said, rising and brushing off my jeans, the denim soft against my skin. Some of us have early mornings. Lillian smirked, her eyes glinting with amusement. Off to code another blog site for a dive bar? I slung my worn canvas bag over my shoulder, its weight reassuring, packed with board briefings, legal filings, and the kind of power they'd never understand. Midge, Margaret called, her voice saccharine. Next time, maybe dress more like a Thornton. Appearances matter, dear. I paused at the door, turning to face her with a small smile. Don't worry, I said. Tomorrow, I'll look exactly like the Thorntons expect. They just didn't realize I was already the one running the show. If you've been quietly rooting for me, don't miss what happens when the boardroom doors swing open. Subscribe to the channel so you're the first to see how my family reacts when they realize the failure they dismiss now holds the keys to everything. I stepped out into the cool Michigan night, the lake's breeze carrying the scent of pine, and felt the weight of tomorrow settle over me like a mantle. The next morning, I stood in my real office, a penthouse floor in downtown Grand Rapids, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city's skyline, the Grand River winding like a silver thread below. This was Nexlify's nerve center, a space of clean lines and quiet power, where I'd spent countless nights refining code, negotiating deals, and dreaming of a tech industry that served people, not just profits. My assistant, Clara, walked in briskly, setting a latte on my desk beside my laptop. The startup board is seated, she said, her voice crisp. Your family got here early, trying to charm the independent members. I smirked, imagining James's slick handshake and Lillian's practiced laugh, both desperate to salvage their crumbling empire. Audit packets all printed and distributed? I asked, my fingers brushing the edge of my desk, where a framed photo of my college coding team sat, a reminder of the scrappy days when Nexlify was just an idea. Clara nodded. The forensic team uncovered even more than we expected. Offshore accounts, ghost vendors, the works. She paused, her eyes searching mine. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Once they know, there's no going back. They need to learn, I said quietly, my voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was coming. Legacy isn't a license to abuse power. I turned to the glass wall, catching my reflection. Gone were the jeans and thrifted sweater. Today, I wore a tailored charcoal suit, its lines sharp yet soft, a perfect blend of strength and restraint. It was the kind of look Margaret had always dreamed I'd wear to impress a suitor, not to dismantle her house of cards. The ownership announcement goes live in 15 minutes, Clara added, checking her tablet. Once it hits the wires, you'll be unmasked. I nodded, my heart steady despite the storm brewing inside. Then let's begin, I said, picking up my briefcase, its leather cool against my palm. I took one last look at the Grand Rapids skyline, the city I'd quietly made mine, and stepped toward the boardroom. The boardroom was a study in modern elegance, sleek walnut table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view of the city that screamed power. The board members sat in high-backed chairs, their faces a mix of curiosity and tension. My family was clustered at the far end, looking unnerved, underdressed, and visibly rattled. James was in a blazer that screamed trying too hard, Lillian's designer dress was wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, and Margaret's pearls seemed to choke her with every breath. "Who are you?" James barked as I entered, his voice sharp with indignation. "This is a private meeting." I placed my briefcase at the head of the table, the click of its latches echoing in the silence. "I'm Midge Thornton," I said, my voice calm but carrying the weight of a decade's worth of work. Founder and CEO of Nexlify Solutions, the company that owns 60% of this startup and several other ventures your family has been creatively managing. The room froze. Margaret's face drained of color, her hand flying to her pearls. Lillian's jaw dropped, her wine-red lipstick stark against her paling skin. Dad's knuckles whitened around his pen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Midge?" he breathed, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my gaze steady. "Good morning." I opened my briefcase and began sliding audit reports across the table, their crisp pages fanning out like a deck of cards. "Shall we review your financials?" "This is insane," James stammered, his voice cracking. "You're just, what?" "A freelancer in a rented loft." His bluster was fading, replaced by a dawning panic. "I work," I said simply, my voice cutting through his protests. "And I built something real, with integrity, not illusion." The board watched, stunned, as the proud Thornton family began to unravel, one page at a time. "These folders," I continued, my tone measured, contain detailed documentation of every misused fund, inflated invoice, and falsified receipt. I distributed the final set of documents, their weight heavy in my hands. "James, would you care to explain the $1.8 million in R&D that somehow funded your Austin condo?" His face flushed so red I thought he might combust. "Or Lillian," I went on, flipping to the next page, "maybe you'd like to walk us through your client outreach trips to Paris, billed at 5 times the actual cost? You'd air out your own family's laundry like this?" Margaret gasped, her voice trembling with betrayal. "No," I said evenly, meeting her gaze. "You aired it out. I'm just making sure it gets cleaned." Dad finally spoke, his voice low and pleading. "Midge, sweetheart, we can executor_state equals done ID equals Midge Thornton _0_0_0_0, sweetheart, we can explain." I raised a hand, cutting him off. "Don't," I said. "I've watched this family treat our great-grandfather's legacy like a personal ATM. While you mocked my so-called humble life, I was building something better, on values, not vanity." "Why hide it?" Lillian asked, her voice dazed, her eyes searching mine for answers. "Why pretend to be struggling?" "I didn't pretend anything," I replied, my tone firm. "I lived modestly. I invested wisely. You assumed wealth had to be loud." James's voice was barely a whisper. "That Lansing loft, you really live there?" "I own it," I corrected, my voice steady. "And most of the block. And no, I'm not selling it out, because some of us care about people, not just returns." I thought of the families in my building, the single mom who'd lived there for 15 years, the retiree who tended the community garden. They were why I'd kept the rents fair, why I'd invested in renovations that preserved the building's historic charm. Suddenly, phones around the table buzzed, a chorus of notifications breaking the silence. One board member looked up, reading from his screen, "Nexlify Solutions reveals CEO's identity, Midge Thornton, estranged member of the Thornton family, confirmed as head of $1.5 billion tech portfolio." Lillian fumbled her phone, her fingers trembling. "Ranked among top ethical innovators, community programs in Detroit and Lansing," she muttered, her voice trailing off. "This will ruin us," James whispered, his face ashen. "No," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the haze of their panic. "This will save you from yourselves. Effective today, this startup will operate transparently. No more shell games. No more sweetheart contracts. No more charging the company like it's a family credit card. And if we don't comply? James tried to sound bold, but his voice trembled, betraying his fear. I smiled, a small, knowing curve of my lips. Then I'll pass these reports to the SEC. I'm sure they'd find them enlightening. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, as the reality of their situation sank in. What do you want? Dad asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching mine for a shred of mercy. I want you to remember what the Thornton name meant before all this, I said, meeting their gazes one by one. Great-grandfather built tools to connect people, to make lives better, not to exploit them for personal gain. I stood, gathering my papers with deliberate care, the rustle of pages the only sound in the room. You have a choice, I said evenly. Work with me to restore that legacy, or find somewhere else to play your games. I hear Austin's got plenty of startups looking for investors. I turned to leave, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Midge, wait, Dad's voice stopped me just as I reached the door. I paused, my hand on the handle, and glanced back. I was wrong about you, he said, his voice thick with regret. Yes, I replied quietly, my eyes softening for a moment. You were. The aftermath unfolded like a scene from a corporate drama, the kind you'd see on a streaming service with a gritty soundtrack. The media couldn't get enough of Michigan's hidden innovator, the freelancer who'd quietly built a tech empire and dismantled her family's illusions in one board meeting. Tech blogs ran headlines like Thornton Air unmasks as Nexlify CEO, while local papers in Grand Rapids and Lansing hailed me as a champion of ethical tech. Margaret resigned from her charity boards, too ashamed to face the public scrutiny. Lillian's marketing firm collapsed within weeks as clients fled, spooked by the audit's revelations. James faced a formal SEC investigation, his Austin condo seized as evidence of financial misconduct. But not everything was bitter. James, to his credit, enrolled in a business ethics program at the University of Michigan, starting small but showing a flicker of sincerity I hadn't expected. Lillian, meanwhile, began volunteering at one of Nexlify's coding boot camps in Detroit, teaching teens the basics of web design. She told me later, over a quiet coffee, that it gave her more purpose than her corner office ever had. And Dad, he asked to shadow me at Nexlify, not as a patriarch reclaiming control, but as a student eager to understand the company I'd built from nothing. 6 months later, I was back in my Lansing loft, the late afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows, casting warm shadows on the brick walls. I sat at my desk, a salvaged oak piece I'd found at a flea market, reviewing Nexlify's latest quarterly reports. The startup was thriving, its books clean, its AI tools now powering ethical supply chains for small businesses across the Midwest. Our community programs were scaling, with 1,200 kids enrolled in free coding classes in Detroit, Lansing, and Flint. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tracing the edge of a worn notebook, my great-grandfather's, filled with sketches for open-source software and notes about making tech accessible to everyone. He'd been a tinkerer, a dreamer, a man who believed technology should lift people up, not lock them out. I'd found the notebook in a dusty attic box years ago, and it had become my North Star, guiding Nexlify's mission. A knock at the door broke my focus. I opened it to find Mom, standing there in jeans and a simple blouse, no trace of her usual designer armor. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face was bare of makeup, a version of her I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Got your invitation, she said, holding up a flyer for Nexlify's community tech fair, her voice tentative. A tech fair in Lansing. Not exactly my scene. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Maybe it could be. She glanced around my loft, her eyes lingering on the exposed beams, the second-hand furniture, the potted herbs thriving on the windowsill. It wasn't the penthouse she'd imagined for me, but it was mine, earned through years of grit and vision. She picked up a framed photo from my desk, me at 25, grinning at my first software patent ceremony, my hair a mess, my eyes alight with possibility. I never asked, she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. Why this path, Midge? Why tech, why this quiet life? I paused, considering her question, the weight of it settling between us. Because I wanted to build something real, I replied, my voice steady. Not just buy it and flaunt it. Great-grandfather believed tech could change lives, not just bank accounts. I wanted to honor that. She looked at me, her eyes searching, as if seeing me for the first time. And now, she murmured. You control more than all of us combined. I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. Control's not the goal, Mom. Impact is. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the photo. Will you teach me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Come tonight, I said, meeting her gaze. Meet the kids learning to code, the families we're helping. That's where legacy begins. She hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, crossing her face. I watched her leave, the flyer still clutched in her hand, and felt a quiet shift, like the first crack of dawn after a long night. Later, I stood by my window, watching Grand Rapids come alive under the evening sky. The city's lights twinkled like stars, reflecting off the Grand River, a quiet reminder of the life I'd built here. The startup's headquarters glowed in the distance, no longer a monument to greed but a beacon of innovation, its AI tools now powering small businesses and nonprofits across Michigan. My phone pinged with new messages, partnership offers from Silicon Valley, speaking invitations from tech conferences, even a tentative email from James, asking for advice on his ethics coursework. Nexlify was in high demand, but I kept my schedule humane, my routine grounded. Success, to me, wasn't about outshining my family's past, it was about building something that would outlast me, something that mattered. A week later, at Nexlify's community tech fair, I stood by a display of student projects, watching my family step into a world they'd once dismissed. The fair was held in a community center in Lansing, its walls lined with colorful posters and buzzing with the energy of kids showcasing their first apps and games. Mom sat beside Maria, a single mom training to be a developer, listening intently as Maria described her journey from factory work to coding. James was across the room, helping a group of teens debug their game prototype, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet focus I hadn't seen before. Lillian laughed with a table of kids designing animated websites, her designer heels swapped for sneakers, her face lit with genuine joy. Slowly, they were learning, real wealth isn't in what you flaunt, it's in what you preserve, what you share, what you elevate. Dad joined me near a display of 3D printed models, his hands tucked in his pockets, his eyes soft with something like pride. You know, he said, his voice low, your great-grandfather believed tech should shelter hearts, not just wallets. I nodded, my throat tightening. I found his old notebooks, I said. Handwritten notes about open-source tools, about making tech free for those who needed it most. We forgot that. He looked at me, not as a daughter who'd gone astray, but as someone who'd carried the torch he'd dropped. You could have ruined us, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Never the point, I replied, watching a little girl across the room squeal as her app launched successfully. I wanted to build something that outlives me, something that honors what he started. Sometimes, the greatest success isn't in proving them wrong, it's in offering them a better version of right. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly counted out, then maybe you see a little of yourself in me. I didn't set out to shame my family. I just wanted to build something real, something that couldn't be taken away because it was rooted in values, not vanity. If my story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. What would you do in my shoes? What have you built in silence while others doubted you? Let's talk about it, let's give each other credit for the quiet work, the long nights, the tough choices that no one sees. And if you're facing a moment like I once did, when the world expects nothing from you, don't shout louder. Just build stronger. You don't need approval to begin, you need purpose and consistency. The rest will come. Support this journey by subscribing to the channel. There are more stories ahead about resilience, redemption, and redefining success on your own terms. Because legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you create. And sometimes, the best kind of triumph doesn't roar, it endures. So, subscribe, stay with me, and let's build something that lasts.